You can outrun the shockwave, you can hide from fallout, but when the sky collapses and the sun disappears, there is no bunker deep enough and no distance far enough. Because in a nuclear war, the part you fear most isn't the blast, it's what comes after, the one threat no one on Earth can escape. Most people believe a nuclear apocalypse means instant extinction, one blinding flash that wipes humanity from existence. It's a simple, almost comforting belief because it leaves no questions, no uncertainty, no suffering, but the reality is far darker, far more complicated, and infinitely more terrifying. A full-scale nuclear exchange between superpowers like the United States and Russia would kill hundreds of millions instantly. Cities would vaporize. Firestorms would consume everything in seconds. Billions more would face famine and radiation as the global climate collapses into nuclear winter. And yet, even in the middle of this unimaginable destruction, humanity as a species would not disappear. People far from strategic targets, especially throughout the southern hemisphere, would survive the initial strikes. Survival wouldn't depend on high-tech bunkers or advanced equipment. It would hinge on two shockingly ordinary factors: distance from ground zero and something as simple as a basement capable of blocking up to 90% of radiation during the first crucial weeks. Even smaller regional conflicts tell the same grim truth. A hypothetical India-Pakistan exchange involving around 100 warheads would devastate both nations, killing tens of millions. Regional temperatures could still drop by around 5 degrees, crippling agriculture, but even then, the world would not face complete annihilation, and history gives us the most unsettling proof of all. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two cities reduced to ash in an instant, eventually rebuilt. People returned, life pushed forward. Recovery, no matter how painful, was still possible. The apocalypse would destroy civilization as we know it, but the myth of instant extinction, that's the first mistake, and the most dangerous misunderstandings are still waiting ahead. The belief that humanity would vanish overnight isn't just inaccurate, it distracts from the real complex mechanics of survival in a nuclear war. The truth is far more nuanced and far more unsettling. While a massive US-Russia exchange would devastate global civilization, human extinction remains unlikely because the survival depends on geography, targeting priorities, and surprisingly simple protective measures. The areas most likely to endure the initial chaos are those far from strategic value, particularly in the southern hemisphere. Countries with fewer military installations, fewer major cities, and minimal geopolitical significance would avoid direct strikes. And for individuals, the simplest form of shelter, a basement, a storm cellar, or any underground space, becomes a lifeline. Such places can reduce radiation exposure by 90% during the first 2 weeks when fallout is at its most dangerous. This reality challenges the dramatic idea that nuclear explosions leave no survivors, but it also introduces a grim truth. Surviving the blast is not the same as surviving the world that comes after. Even limited regional conflicts can reshape the atmosphere. A hypothetical India-Pakistan war involving around 100 warheads would annihilate major cities across both nations, killing tens of millions instantly. The rest of the globe would not face the immediate blast effects, but the smoke and soot from burning cities would still darken skies, lower regional temperatures by roughly 5 degrees Celsius, and trigger massive crop failures. Yet despite the horror, humanity would continue. The examples of Hiroshima and Nagasaki show this painfully. Those cities were reduced to ash in an instant, yet within years they were rebuilt. People returned, raised families, rebuilt communities, and proved that nuclear devastation, while nightmarish, does not equate to eternal ruin. This is the uncomfortable truth. Nuclear war would be catastrophic beyond measure, but complete extinction requires a perfectly executed global strike where every warhead detonates in ideal conditions, a scenario so unlikely that it drifts into fiction. But if extinction doesn't come from the blast, then what does threaten the long-term survival of most who endure the initial strikes? The answer is waiting above their heads, forming quietly in the wounded sky. What truly threatens the survivors of a nuclear exchange is not the blast, not the radiation, and not even the immediate chaos. It is what happens to the sky itself. This is where fiction accidentally grazes the truth, though usually in the wrong way. Films love to show ash-gray horizons and frozen wastelands as if nuclear winter is just an artistic backdrop, a stylistic choice to signal the end of the world. But the real phenomenon is far more precise, far more violent, and far more terrifying. In the hours after multiple detonations across major cities, firestorms erupt. Not simple fires, but self-sustaining infernos that behave like living creatures. These firestorms create their own weather systems, generating winds that can reach 300 miles per hour. Every gust funnels fresh oxygen into an expanding sea of flames, ensuring that nothing combustible survives. Entire neighborhoods become furnaces. Vehicles melt, buildings collapse, and the heat is so extreme that air near the surface surges upward in powerful columns. And these updrafts don't stop in the lower atmosphere. They punch through the troposphere with enough force to inject millions of tons of black soot directly into the stratosphere, a region of the atmosphere where normal weather cannot clean or wash anything out. Once soot enters the stratosphere, it spreads globally within weeks, carried by high-altitude winds that wrap around the planet. Sunlight, which normally delivers about 1,000 watts per square meter to Earth's surface, suddenly drops to a fraction of that. Days grow dim, temperatures fall rapidly, photosynthesis begins to fail, and this is the moment when nuclear winter shifts from theory into a lethal chain reaction. Agriculture, the foundation of modern civilization, collapses because crops need stable temperatures and predictable sunlight. Even a 5-degree drop during critical growing months slashes yields by up to 90%. Rice fields, wheat belts, corn heartlands across entire continents fail simultaneously, not because they were hit by bombs, but because the sky itself has been darkened. A large U.S.-Russia exchange could loft at least 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere. Temperatures in some regions might drop 10 to 20 degrees, shrinking the growing season from 6 months to barely 2. And even that short window would occur in colder, darker conditions where plants cannot survive. This is the true killer of a nuclear war, not the fire, not the fallout, but a sun that suddenly betrays the earth beneath it. Once the skies darken and global temperatures fall, the world enters the most devastating phase of a nuclear conflict, the collapse of agriculture and the cascading famine that follows. This is the part most people underestimate because it doesn't happen instantly like a blast. It unfolds slowly, relentlessly, and with a cruelty that leaves no region untouched. Modern farming depends on long, stable growing seasons with reliable sunlight, rainfall, and temperature ranges, but nuclear winter shatters all of it at once. A drop of even 5 degrees during essential planting months is enough to reduce crop yields by 70 to 90%. And in a scenario where millions of tons of soot blanket the sky, sunlight is slashed so severely that photosynthesis barely functions. The air grows cold, the soil stays frozen longer, and fields that once fed nations become barren. Rice paddies across Asia dry and crack. Wheat belts in North America wither before harvest. Cornfields in South America, normally resilient, fail entirely because they cannot absorb enough light to grow. Global food systems, which operate on delicate supply chains and predictable harvest cycles, collapse almost instantly. Countries that rely on imports face starvation first, but exporting powers fall next because they no longer produce enough for themselves. A full-scale U.S.-Russia exchange could shrink the Northern Hemisphere's growing season from 6 productive months to barely 2, and even those 2 months occur in a darker, cooler post-strike climate, making meaningful cultivation nearly impossible. Livestock die from lack of feed. Fisheries shrink as plankton. The foundation of the ocean's food chain declines from reduced sunlight. The world plunges into a famine so vast that billions are at risk, many far outside the zones touched by initial detonations. This is the brutal irony. The majority of nuclear war deaths would not come from fire, shockwaves, or radiation. They would come from empty fields, silent oceans, and cities haunted by hunger. In a nuclear war, people do not starve because the bombs killed the crops. They starve because the sky did. For decades, nuclear winter has been one of the most hotly debated subjects in scientific research, and these debates reveal something deeply unsettling. Even experts cannot fully agree on what would happen after a major nuclear war. Early nuclear winter models of the 1980s painted the bleakest possible outcomes. These simulations assumed the largest Cold War arsenals ever built, with targeting strategies designed to maximize civilian casualties. They imagined every warhead striking dense urban centers during dry seasons, the perfect recipe for massive firestorms that would loft unprecedented amounts of soot into the stratosphere. Those early models terrified an entire generation, but modern research has exposed major gaps. Not all nuclear targets are cities. Many missiles would strike isolated military bases, rural silos, or remote installations where fuel sources are limited. Without enough combustible material, firestorms may be far smaller than the original models assumed. Weather matters too. Detonations during wet seasons or winter months produce significantly less soot. Even urban construction patterns have changed. Modern cities contain far more concrete and steel, materials that burn differently compared to the wood-heavy structures of the 1980s. This changes the composition and altitude of smoke plumes, and therefore changes how much soot actually reaches the stratosphere. As a result, some scientists argue that a full-scale nuclear conflict might create a nuclear autumn instead of a decade-long winter, with temperature drops of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius lasting months rather than years. But this is not a comforting revision. Even a short-term cooling of that magnitude would devastate global agriculture, disrupt food supplies, and create mass starvation. The real scientific battle, however, centers on regional nuclear wars, especially conflicts involving India and Pakistan. Rutgers University studies suggest that using around 125 kiloton weapons could inject enough soot to drop global temperatures by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius for 5 years, reducing worldwide food production by up to 30%. But other researchers dispute these numbers, arguing that soot injection heights were overestimated and that fire sizes were exaggerated. And this is where the deepest fear lies. We simply do not know. The world is gambling with billions of lives based on models that contradict one another at fundamental levels. No real-world test has ever existed, and the first test might be the last mistake humanity ever makes. One of the strangest and most persistent misconceptions about nuclear war is the belief that radioactive fallout spreads like a contagious plague, infecting anyone who comes into contact with it and turning survivors into carriers who poison others. Popular games and films accidentally reinforce this myth, portraying glowing wastelands centuries after detonation, as if radiation simply lingers forever. But fallout is not a viral threat. It is physical matter. Tiny radioactive particles of dust, soil, metal, and debris sucked upward by the mushroom cloud and then scattered by the wind. And the most important truth is that fallout decays rapidly. Many of the most dangerous isotopes, like iodine-131, have half-lives of just 8 days, meaning they break down into safer levels within weeks. Longer-lived isotopes such as cesium-137 persist for decades, but even they gradually fade into background radiation over time. Fallout does not leap from person to person. You cannot catch radiation sickness by touching a survivor. Once particles settle, they remain where they fall. Sheltering indoors for the first 48 hours, the period when fallout is most intense, dramatically reduces exposure. After those 2 days, most of the lethal radiation has already diminished, and survivors can begin emerging cautiously as decay continues. Another misconception is that nuclear explosions create eternally poisoned wastelands. In reality, detonation height determines how much fallout forms. High-altitude bursts produce far less ground contamination because they don't suck as much debris upward. This is why places like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which suffered unimaginable devastation, eventually returned to habitable radiation levels. People live, work, and raise families there today without the imaginary glow-in-the-dark effects that fiction loves to exaggerate. Even plutonium, a word that inspires dread, is less immediately toxic than caffeine gram for gram. Its real danger lies in inhalation or ingestion of alpha particles, not in simple proximity. The persistent wasteland image survives because it's visually dramatic, not scientifically accurate. And while radioactive waste from reactors and long-term storage sites can remain hazardous for thousands of years, That is a completely different category from the short-lived fallout generated immediately after a nuclear strike. Fallout is deadly, yes, but not in the supernatural infectious way pop culture suggests. Understanding this difference does not make nuclear war less terrifying. It simply replaces fantasy with a far more sobering reality. The mythology surrounding nuclear radiation doesn't end with fallout. Another widespread misconception, one that has shaped decades of films, comics, and video games, is the idea that radiation creates visible, dramatic mutations. Pop culture insists that survivors morph into monsters, grow new limbs, gain superhuman strength, or become ghoul-like creatures haunting the ruins. But real radiation does nothing of the sort. Radiation damages the body at the cellular level by breaking chemical bonds in DNA. When this happens, cells face three possible outcomes. They repair the damage, they die, or they survive with corrupted DNA. High doses overwhelm the body's repair systems, leading to acute radiation sickness, organ failure, and death. Moderate doses increase the risk of cancers such as leukemia and thyroid cancer, which emerge years later as damaged cells replicate uncontrollably. And when reproductive cells suffer DNA damage, the consequences may be passed to children in the form of birth defects or developmental issues. This is not speculation, it is documented reality. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki experience higher rates of cancer decades after exposure. The Chernobyl disaster produced clusters of thyroid cancer among children downwind of the radioactive plume. Families suffered generational genetic impacts, but none of these effects resembled the dramatic transformation seen in fiction. No ghouls, no mutants with glowing eyes, no superhuman abilities. The truth is deeply tragic, not visually spectacular. Mutations are random, overwhelmingly harmful, and almost never beneficial in a way evolution could use. Radiation does not grant powers, it destroys the body's ability to function normally. Even natural background radiation from rocks, soil, and cosmic rays bombards us constantly at low levels. It's identical to man-made radiation, just weaker, but once exposure reaches high thresholds, especially around 500 rem, half of all humans exposed will die without immediate medical treatment. Fiction clings to the mutant narrative because it offers something dramatic and symbolic. It turns an invisible threat into a visible monster. It transforms survivors into something visually shocking rather than showing the slow, painful onset of cancer or hereditary defects. But the reality is far darker than any fantasy. Radiation doesn't create monsters. It quietly, invisibly breaks the body from the inside out. The fantasy of radiation granting superpowers is one of the most persistent and seductive myths in modern storytelling. Movies imagine Godzilla rising from atomic tests. Comic books show heroes unlocking extraordinary abilities after exposure. And games portray wasteland survivors evolving into stronger, faster, mutated beings. This narrative is powerful because it transforms tragedy into transformation. But scientifically, it is entirely false. Radiation has no creative power. It does not enhance the human body or awaken hidden potential. Instead, it breaks the most fundamental structures of life. At the molecular level, ionizing radiation shatters DNA strands, disrupts cellular machinery, and overwhelms repair systems. When DNA is damaged, the outcome is chaos. Cancers that develop silently for years, cells that malfunction or die, or genetic defects passed quietly to the next generation. None of this produces mutant abilities. Radiation does not engineer new organs, strengthen muscles, or trigger evolutionary leaps. Evolutionary beneficial mutations occur slowly across thousands of generations, not through catastrophic bursts of radiation. Every mutation caused by radiation is random, unplanned, and almost always harmful, the exact opposite of what fiction suggests. Even creatures portrayed as radiation-forged giants like Godzilla are rooted in 1950s anxieties rather than biological reality. Real-world studies support this. Research on Hiroshima and Chernobyl survivors reveals increased cancer rates and heritable genetic damage, but no enhanced strength, intelligence, or unusual traits. The true effects of radiation are tragically mundane: tumors, immune system collapse, reproductive issues, and shortened lifespans. The glamorous mutation myth survives not because it's realistic, but because it gives storytellers a visual language for fear. It makes the invisible danger tangible. It replaces the slow horror of disease with the spectacle of transformation. But fantasy masks the genuine threat, the silent internal unraveling caused by damaged DNA. Radiation will not make someone superhuman. It will not turn them into monsters or heroes. It simply harms, breaks, and destroys. That truth, stripped of all cinematic flair, is far more frightening than any imaginary mutant lurking in a wasteland. The fantasy of radiation granting superpowers is one of the most persistent and seductive myths in modern storytelling. Movies imagine Godzilla rising from atomic test, comic books show heroes unlocking extraordinary abilities after exposure, and games portray wasteland survivors evolving into stronger, faster, mutated beings. And this narrative is powerful because it transforms tragedy into transformation. But scientifically, it is entirely false. Radiation has no creative power. It does not enhance the human body or awaken hidden potential. Instead, it breaks the most fundamental structures of life. At the molecular level, ionizing radiation shatters DNA strands, disrupts cellular machinery, and overwhelms repair systems. When DNA is damaged, the outcome is chaos. Cancers that develop silently for years, cells that malfunction or die, or genetic defects pass quietly to the next generation. None of this produces mutant abilities. Radiation does not engineer new organs, strengthen muscles, or trigger evolutionary leaps. Evolutionary beneficial mutations occur slowly across thousands of generations, not through catastrophic bursts of radiation. Every mutation caused by radiation is random, unplanned, and almost always harmful, the exact opposite of what fiction suggests. Even creatures portrayed as radiation-forged giants like Godzilla are rooted in 1950s anxieties rather than biological reality. Real-world studies support this. Research on Hiroshima and Chernobyl survivors reveals increased cancer rates and heritable genetic damage, but no enhanced strength, intelligence, or unusual traits. The true effects of radiation are tragically mundane: tumors, immune system collapse, reproductive issues, and shortened lifespans. The glamorous mutation myth survives not because it's realistic, but because it gives storytellers a visual language for fear. It makes the invisible danger tangible. It replaces the slow horror of disease with the spectacle of transformation. But fantasy masks the genuine threat, the silent internal unraveling caused by damaged DNA. Radiation will not make someone superhuman. It will not turn them into monsters or heroes. It simply harms, breaks, and destroys. That truth, stripped of all cinematic flair, is far more frightening than any imaginary mutant lurking in a wasteland. The idea of an EMP throwing humanity back into the Stone Age is one of the most exaggerated doomsday fantasies ever created. It imagines a world where every car stalls, every computer melts, every power line explodes, and every country collapses permanently into darkness, all from a single detonation high in the sky. But the real effects of an EMP, while serious, are far less apocalyptic and far more irregular. First, EMPs are not continuous waves of destruction. They are momentary bursts, a single pulse lasting fractions of a second. Once that pulse passes, any electronics that survived will continue functioning normally. It isn't a sweeping magical force that keeps frying devices forever. Second, modern infrastructure is not as fragile as doomsday fiction suggests. Many components of the electrical grid are naturally shielded or partially protected by how they are built. Underground cables, buried lines, reinforced substations, and even metal building frames act like accidental Faraday cages, reducing the strength of the pulse. Circuit breakers and surge protectors in the power grid isolate damage instead of letting failures cascade indefinitely. Military hardware is even more resistant. For decades, armed forces have hardened their essential systems to survive EMPs through shielded enclosures, robust wiring, and redundant designs. Even civilian equipment has some level of incidental protection simply because it wasn't built to be exposed directly to open-air electromagnetic surges. And here's another crucial truth. EMP strength depends enormously on altitude. A perfectly optimized EMP requires a detonation at high altitude, far higher than most nuclear weapons are ever deployed. Low altitude or ground level explosions generate far weaker pulses because their energy is absorbed by air and earth long before it can spread. So what would actually happen? A high altitude EMP could cause regional blackouts. It might damage some transformers, disrupt communications, and knock out poorly shielded electronics. Some cars might stall if their circuitry catches the pulse at precisely the wrong moment, while others continue driving as if nothing happened. Utilities would scramble to assess and replace damaged components, leading to outages that might last days, weeks, or in severe cases, months. But society would not collapse forever. The grid would not vanish. The world would not regress to primitive living. Repairs, though challenging, would be targeted rather than total. The EMP myth thrives because it's clean and dramatic, a catastrophe without radiation, fire, or casualties. But reality is far more grounded. EMPs disrupt civilization, not erase it. They break pieces of the machine, not the entire world. Among all the misunderstandings surrounding nuclear war, none is more dangerous or more comforting than the belief that nuclear deterrence is perfectly reliable. People imagine a world where the sheer fear of mutual destruction keeps every leader rational, every military cautious, and every crisis under control. But history tells a far more fragile story. Deterrence is not a force field. It is not a scientific law. It is a psychological bet that every person with the power to launch a nuclear weapon will make the right decision every time, under every circumstance, forever. And that assumption has nearly failed again and again. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is often cited as proof that deterrence works, but the truth is the opposite. The world came within hours, maybe minutes, of nuclear war, not because leaders wanted it, but because miscommunication, fear, and military pressure pushed both sides toward the brink. A Soviet submarine commander, isolated and under stress, nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. Only one officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused authorization. One man prevented global annihilation. That was not deterrence. That was luck. In 1983, a Soviet early warning system detected what looked like 5 incoming U.S. missiles. Protocol demanded retaliation. Officer Stanislav Petrov had minutes to decide whether to report the attack up the chain of command, which would have triggered an automatic nuclear response. He chose to trust his instincts and declared it a false alarm. And he was right. A satellite misinterpreted sunlight reflecting off clouds. Again, the world was saved by one human decision, not by deterrence theory, and these are just the stories we know. There were countless other near catastrophes: the 1979 NORAD computer glitch showing a massive Soviet strike, the Damascus Titan II missile explosion in 1980, the 1995 Norwegian rocket launch mistaken for a nuclear first strike. Deterrence did not prevent any of these, fragile human judgment did. Beyond accidents, deterrence also fails in other ways. Nuclear powers routinely lose wars to smaller non-nuclear states, the US and Vietnam, the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, proving that nuclear arsenals do not guarantee victory or stability. Deterrence also enables aggression. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 despite NATO's nuclear umbrella, then used nuclear threats to discourage Western intervention. Pakistan has repeatedly provoked clashes with India while relying on nuclear weapons as a shield against full retaliation. This is deterrence functioning not as a stabilizing doctrine, but as a tool for coercion. The deeper problem is that deterrence relies on all leaders acting rationally, yet rationality is subjective. What seems logical in Washington may look reckless in Moscow, Beijing, New Delhi, or Islamabad. Every nuclear arsenal, over 12,000 warheads worldwide, depends on perfect control, flawless technology, and infallible decision-making. No system in history has ever met those conditions. Deterrence has held for 80 years, but its survival depends on luck far more than we like to admit, and luck has an expiration date. Among all the misunderstandings surrounding nuclear war, none is more dangerous or more comforting than the belief that nuclear deterrence is perfectly reliable. People imagine a world where the sheer fear of mutual destruction keeps every leader rational, every military cautious, and every crisis under control. But history tells a far more fragile story. Deterrence is not a force field. It is not a scientific law. It is a psychological bet that every person with the power to launch a nuclear weapon will make the right decision every time, under every circumstance, forever. And that assumption has nearly failed again and again. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is often cited as proof that deterrence works. But the truth is the opposite. The world came within hours, maybe minutes, of nuclear war, not because leaders wanted it, but because miscommunication, fear, and military pressure pushed both sides toward the brink. A Soviet submarine commander, isolated and under stress, nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. Only one officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused authorization. One man prevented global annihilation. That was not deterrence, that was luck. In 1983, a Soviet early warning system detected what looked like 5 incoming U.S. missiles. Protocol demanded retaliation. Officer Stanislav Petrov had minutes to decide whether to report the attack up the chain of command, which would have triggered an automatic nuclear response. He chose to trust his instincts and declared it a false alarm. And he was right. A satellite misinterpreted sunlight reflecting off clouds. Again, the world was saved by one human decision, not by deterrence theory. And these are just the stories we know. There were countless other near catastrophes. The 1979 NORAD computer glitch showing a massive Soviet strike, the Damascus Titan II missile explosion in 1980, the 1995 Norwegian rocket launch mistaken for a nuclear first strike. Deterrence did not prevent any of these. Fragile human judgment did. Beyond accidents, deterrence also fails in other ways. Nuclear powers routinely lose wars to smaller non-nuclear states, the U.S. in Vietnam, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, proving that nuclear arsenals do not guarantee victory or stability. Deterrence also enables aggression. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 despite NATO's nuclear umbrella, then used nuclear threats to discourage Western intervention. Pakistan has repeatedly provoked clashes with India while relying on nuclear weapons as a shield against full retaliation. This is deterrence functioning not as a stabilizing doctrine, but as a tool for coercion. The deeper problem is that deterrence relies on all leaders acting rationally, yet rationality is subjective. What seems logical in Washington may look reckless in Moscow, Beijing, New Delhi, or Islamabad. Every nuclear arsenal, over 12,000 warheads worldwide, depends on perfect control, flawless technology, and infallible decision-making. No system in history has ever met those conditions. Deterrence has held for 80 years. But its survival depends on luck far more than we like to admit. And luck has an expiration date. At the very foundation of the nuclear age lies a story that has been repeated so often and taught so confidently that it became an unquestioned truth. The belief that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary to end World War II and save millions of lives. This narrative has justified nuclear weapons for generations, framed them as tools of peace, and shaped global policy. But when you peel away the myth and look closely at the historical record, a much more complicated yet and far more unsettling truth emerges. And the traditional story claims that Japan surrendered because the atomic bombs were so devastating that the nation had no choice but to capitulate. But declassified documents, internal Japanese records, and the work of historians such as Tsuyoshi Hasegawa reveal a different timeline entirely. Japan's leadership was already searching for a way to end the war, desperate to avoid a full-scale invasion, and negotiating for terms that would preserve the emperor's position. The event that truly shocked Japanese leadership was not the bombing of Nagasaki, it was the Soviet Union's sudden entry into the Pacific War on August 9, 1945. For Japan, this was the nightmare scenario. Their defenses in the north were weak, their military was exhausted, and the prospect of Soviet occupation, especially the spread of communism, was far more terrifying than American air raids, no matter how destructive. U.S. military leaders at the time understood this. General Dwight Eisenhower believed the bombs were unnecessary, Admiral William Leahy called them barbaric and strategically irrelevant. Internal memos show leading officers doubted the bombs were required to force surrender. Yet the myth persisted in part because it provided a convenient moral justification for an act that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and perhaps equally importantly, because it sent a powerful message to the Soviet Union about America's post-war dominance. Some historians argue that the bombings served less as a final strike against Japan and more as an opening move in the geopolitical chess match that would become the Cold War. This reinterpretation does not erase the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Instead, it reveals that the origins of nuclear policy are rooted not in necessity, but in fear, power, and political strategy. And if the very beginning of the nuclear age is built on a myth, then every justification built on top of it becomes unstable. The belief that nuclear weapons keep the peace, the belief that deterrence is reliable, the belief that these weapons are unavoidable tools of security. All of it becomes questionable. Understanding the truth does not make the world safer by itself, but it strips away the illusions we have used to comfort ourselves, illusions that may be the most dangerous myths of all. If this story resonated with you, please share your sense of strength in the comments, and let's spread this quiet pride to the world. If a 2027 reset truly unfolds the way history, geopolitics, and monetary patterns suggest, then preparation isn't optional, it's survival. In every currency collapse from 1933 to 1971, there were clear winners and unmistakable losers. And the people who came out on top weren't the richest, the most educated, or the most connected. They were the ones who understood the pattern early and positioned themselves before the shockwave hit. What follows are the strategies historically proven to protect wealth and in many cases multiply it during a currency reset. These are not speculative ideas, they are the same moves families, investors, and nations used during the last two major resets. Strategy 1. Own physical gold, but store it wisely. Gold is the oldest form of financial insurance on earth. If confiscation happens, gold you surrender will be bought by the government at the old price. But gold you legally secure or store outside direct seizure risk appreciates at the new price after revaluation. In 1933, those who hid or relocated their gold quietly became far wealthier than those who complied. It's high reward, but historically high risk. So the method of storage matters more than the metal itself. Strategy 2. Hold gold outside U.S. jurisdiction. Buying and storing gold in countries like Switzerland or Singapore offers insulation. If the U.S. moves to restrict domestic gold ownership, foreign-held, allocated gold remains untouched. This strategy is legal, discreet, and used by institutions, wealthy families, and governments who understand what resets look like. Strategy 3. Own gold mining stocks. Miners benefit from revaluation without the confiscation risk. A company that owns millions of ounces in the ground sees the value of its reserves explode without lifting a finger. This is why mining stocks historically outperformed physical gold after major monetary shocks. Foreign mining companies, Canadian, Australian, South African, carry even lower geopolitical risk. Strategy 4. Buy hard assets and borrow against them. This is one of the most powerful moves available. Real estate, farmland, and productive properties retain intrinsic value after reset, while the dollar-denominated debt attached to them becomes almost meaningless. After a 90% currency devaluation, a $300,000 mortgage feels like a $30,000 debt in real terms. The asset remains, the debt evaporates. This is how millions created generational wealth after 1971 without realizing it. Strategy 5. Diversify into strong foreign currencies and global assets. Holding Swiss francs, the Singapore dollars, Norwegian kroner, or foreign stocks and real estate insulates your portfolio from a dollar reset. When the dollar weakens sharply, foreign currencies strengthen in relative terms. Global diversification becomes a shield. Strategy X. Build survival reserves, not out of fear but practicality. Every reset causes temporary chaos, bank closures, payment disruptions, supply chain issues, shortages. In 1933 and 1971, disruptions were brief, But in a world of digital banking and instant panic, they could be far more severe. Having reserves of essentials, food, water, medicine, fuel, turns chaos into inconvenience instead of catastrophe. None of these strategies are guarantees, but history is unambiguous. During every major monetary transition, those who survived and prospered were the ones who held real assets, diversified early, and refused to trust a system already collapsing under its own weight. A reset doesn't create wealth, it redistributes it. And in the redistribution, the prepared rise while the unprepared fall. This is the moment where everything comes together: the history, the patterns, the geopolitical tensions, the mathematical certainty of debt, and the signals coming directly from those in power. What you've heard isn't a theory. It isn't a guess. It's the same sequence that unfolded in 1933, the same playbook executed in 1971, and the same trajectory the U.S. is following again today, step by step, crisis by crisis, denial by denial. A return to a gold-backed dollar isn't guaranteed, but the conditions that force a reset are already locked in. The dollar is weakening, BRICS is rising, U.S. debt is unpayable. The global financial order is shifting whether America wants it to or not. Trump has the advisors who support a gold reset. He has the political incentive. And he may soon have the crisis that makes such a move not only possible, but inevitable. If this reset happens in 2027, it will become the largest wealth transfer in modern history. Gold could be revalued to $10,000, even $20,000 an ounce. Dollar savings could lose $80, 90% of their purchasing power. Pensions could collapse. Bonds could evaporate. The middle class could be hollowed out overnight. And the line between those who saw the pattern early and those who ignored it will be unmistakable. Every currency reset in history punishes those who wait. It punishes those who trust politicians to tell the truth. It punishes those who believe it can't happen here. And it rewards those who prepare, those who move into hard assets, diversify, and position themselves before the announcement, not after. Yet because once the reset begins, once the dollar is revalued, once the new system is revealed, it's already too late and the winners have been chosen. The losers are locked in. And the world you knew is gone. You now have the pattern. You now know the timeline. And you now understand what 2027 could bring. The only question left is simple. Will you prepare or will you hope?